Ability checks sometimes happen more often than combat encounters, and a lot of classes, backgrounds, and races give you the ability to gain proficiency in some of the skills. But which ones are actually the best? In this list, we'll be going over the 10 best skills that you should probably want to pick a proficiency in. And at number 10, we have medicine. Now, many people actually consider the medicine skill to be almost useless, because if you have a healer in your party, then you don't ever really need a medicine check, outside of a few niche situations where you might want to determine how long a body has been dead for, where a DM could probably just use investigation instead. However, medicine is one of the few skills in the game that actually has combat benefits. You see, if there is a downed party member, you can use an action in order to perform a medicine check in order to stabilize them so they no longer have to roll death saving throws. And the DC to stabilize someone is only 10. So, normally you have about a 50% chance to stabilize someone with a medicine check, assuming no other modifiers to your wisdom or medicine skill, where they then regain 1 hit point if they're not healed after 1d4 hours. So having any increase to your wisdom is just a bonus on top of this, which makes it easier to save someone. The reason most people consider medicine useless though, is because a healer can get someone up and actually back into the battle with just literally any form of healing. And also a healer's kit can expend one of its 10 charges in order to immediately stabilize someone without having to perform a medicine check. So because most parties have someone who can heal, or a healing potion, you don't need to perform a medicine check very often in combat, where just healing someone up is mechanically better. And also, you can completely replace the need of a medicine check with just a simple basic item, and only using one of its 10 charges of that healer's kit. But sometimes you only have one party member who's a healer, and maybe they're the one who just went down and needs to be stabilized. And maybe no one in your party did buy a healer's kit, because I've never had a party that bothered to buy one. In fact, I've seen more medicine rolls than people using healer kits in my times of playing D&D. So, for medicine being purely an actual beneficial skill to use that can potentially save someone's life, I have it in the top 10 even if technically it is kind of not a very used skill, especially compared to the top 9. And at number 9, we have Sleight of Hand. Sleight of Hand simply determines how well you're able to steal things from another person without them noticing, the ability to plant something on someone else without them noticing, or to conceal an object on your person from someone else. So Sleight of Hand in everyday life is not a super useful skill to have, but in D&D, these kinds of occasions come up a lot more than you'd think. I don't think I've ever been in a game where Sleight of Hand wasn't needed a handful of times, and sometimes where it's been absolutely crucial to some plot points. Like the first chapter of The Wild Beyond the Witchlight basically requires someone to succeed a Sleight of Hand check in order to progress the story without getting a bad result. And sometimes you just might need to steal something from a bad guy without defeating them. Or sometimes you're playing a rogue who just wants to steal for fun. Whatever the case, out of the 18 skills in the game, Sleight of Hand is one of the more useful ones, but definitely not a heavily used one like some of the higher spots on this list. And at number 8, we have Investigation. Investigation is a skill that's used in order to make deductions based on clues that you can already see. Kind of like Sherlock Holmes trying to figure out what happens in a crime scene. You don't use Investigation in order to find missing pieces. You use Investigation in order to try to figure out what's happened based on things you already know of. Although a lot of the times I've seen in other games, people use Investigation in order to find traps or to just look for things. Something that's covered by a different skill that we'll talk about later on in the list. And because it's so commonly used for a purpose it wasn't really intended for, it actually gets used quite a bit in a lot of games. Now, the rulebooks for D&D don't really have hard, fast rules of what you can and can't do with a lot of the different skills, and normally they just kind of reference the skills randomly in different rules, so it's perfectly fine to use Investigation in this way, since some of the suggested ways to use it are to find the location of a hidden object, figure out what kind of weapon causes a certain kind of wound, or even use to determine the weak points in a tunnel in case you wish to collapse it. And at number 7, we have Acrobatics. Acrobatics is a dexterity check where the most I've ever seen it used in a game is someone trying to convince me that they can use it instead of athletics for something. Because acrobatics is kind of like the skill check equivalent of a saving throw to an extent. Because there's a lot of monsters and rules in the game that allow you to make a contested roll, where you choose to either use acrobatics or athletics. And normally people have a higher dexterity score than a strength score, so most of the time they want to use acrobatics. Now, what acrobatics is actually used for is not half bad in the average adventuring game of D&D. You can use it to run across a slippery floor, balance on a tightrope, or trying to perform some kind of acrobatic stunt, like diving, flipping, or maybe even jumping off of a wall. Acrobatics really allows you to be creative with how you use your character, and it kind of exists as a way for your DM to allow you to attempt something crazy. And at number 6, we have Athletics. Athletics is really the more useful of the two physical skill checks, as a lot of the rules and modules call for athletic checks way more than acrobatics. If you wish to perform the combat options of either a grapple or shove, for example, they require you to perform an athletics check and then contest it by your opponent's either athletics or acrobatics check. Athletics is also used for a whole bunch of strength-related things, which just comes up a lot more often than you'd think, like climbing, jumping, or swimming in situations that are more difficult than normal. But since a lot of the official rules for combat options kind of require athletics, it is slightly better than acrobatics. And a lot of the modules call for more athletic rolls on average than acrobatic ones too, just because of how much more common it is need to do something athletic than to tumble around and do a flip. And at number 5, we have Deception. Deception is your ability to convincingly lie to a target or to just convincingly hide the truth. Like a guard comes up and asks why there's a whole bunch of dead bodies on the floor. You would need to perform a deception check to tell them that you just found them there and didn't kill them yourselves. Or if you're trying to pass yourself off in some kind of disguise, you'll probably need a lot of deception checks in order to navigate your way socially through whatever you're using the disguise for. Or if you're just trying to con someone, deception is generally the social skill used in that situation. While deception does come up quite a bit in the average game, there's a big problem with deception where players will sometimes argue that they should not need to use deception if a DM asks them specifically to use it in a situation. Like, for example, if a guard comes up to your party and asks why there's a whole bunch of dead bodies on the floor, and someone tries to give an explanation of what happened, a DM might reasonably call for a deception check, where I would probably see party members that would definitely argue that they're not technically lying and just telling them what happened and just leaving out the truth, or some other kind of mental gymnastics. Basically, players don't like to make deception checks unless they specifically ask for it. And I've seen this happen many times in different kinds of games with many different groups as well. And the reason is because there's a certain amount of risk involved in failing a deception check when compared to just a normal persuasion check. But this also goes to prove how often deception comes up, so it's definitely a great skill to have a proficiency in. And at number 4, we have the Insight check. Now, the official way to use Insight is that it's basically your way to read the true intentions of a creature, like if you're trying to determine if they're lying or to predict their next move. The way it's actually used in games is just straight up as a lie detector. In fact, players get really upset if you don't use it exactly like a lie detector. So, while it might not be a lie detector, as there are certain spells that are supposed to give you the ability to detect lies, it's very commonly used as one anyway, which definitely makes it a very valuable skill. Even if you use it in its intended purpose, a successful insight check should give you some kind of indication that maybe they're not telling the truth, even if it doesn't tell you that they're specifically lying about something, which is still pretty useful. Incredibly useful even, to the point where it's one of the best skills in the game because of how often you do need to figure out if someone is lying to you or not, or at the very least to find out if your character notices something suspicious about someone that you can then investigate later. And at number 3, we have Stealth. This is another one of the few skills in the game that actually has combat benefits, and in fact the whole surprise mechanic is entirely dependent on high stealth scores, and some subclasses even get a whole bunch of benefits from being able to be stealth. The stealth skill is pretty self-explanatory in that it determines your ability to conceal yourself from enemies. So you may be able to slip past guards without notice, or sneak up on someone without being seen or heard, or to maybe get a surprise attack in. Depending on the game or what character you're playing, you may never use a stealth check at all. But when you do need to perform one, you'll definitely prefer to be able to do it with some kind of bonus, rather than trying to roll it without one, because they're generally pretty important when they do come up. And at number 2, we have Persuasion. Persuasion is a skill that you use when you're trying to get into the good graces of a person or a group of people, generally in a good-natured way. And since persuasion is a way you get people on your side without lying to them or yelling at them, it's generally the preferred social skill check of choice for a vast majority of players. Technically, intimidation also works for the same purposes, but in my experience, and from what I've read online, people rarely use intimidation, even if they have a high charisma score, as DMs generally punish a failed intimidation check way harsher than they would a failed persuasion check, where both of them might accomplish the same thing on a success, to the point where people would just rather use persuasion over everything else anyway. Because if you fail an intimidation or deception check, then the target that you're trying to do those two things to might react very violently to someone threatening them or lying to them, Whereas they probably wouldn't react very violently to a failed persuasion check, since you're not doing anything harmful in that process. And since persuasion usually has a better fail state, where you can just kind of keep trying, this is why people always argue to use persuasion rather than deception or intimidation. And since it is used so much for pretty much every social encounter, this is one of the premier skills to get a proficiency in, even if you don't use charisma as your main stat. In fact, some groups will power game their composition to have one player play the face of the party, and try to get expertise in persuasion just to always have them do the talking for every NPC. And it works very well, to the point where I've seen groups go so far as to yell at players who aren't the face of the party trying to talk to an important NPC. And at number 1, we have Perception. Perception is a skill that allows you to see, hear, or otherwise smell the presence of something else. Perception is basically your ability to perceive the world, and it's the only skill check in the game where your passive modifier Perception gives you a failsafe where you can't possibly roll lower than your passive perception. And the explanation for this by one of the game designers was that your passive perception is always on, so you're always passively observing the world through your senses. So if you perform a perception check, it's impossible for you to have a lower score than your passive perception because you've already seen everything that's possible to see with your passive perception, and you can't possibly see less than that. And while technically there is a passive score in every skill check that can be used, your DM can choose to not use them except for passive perception. There's just special unwritten rules for passive perception. It's the only passive skill that every monster in the monster manual has a score listed on their character sheets of, for example, and also interacts with the rules of stealth and the surprise condition. And perception is a skill you use if you're trying to find trapdoors and stuff, or to determine anything that requires you to look for stuff. Perception is what you're supposed to use when you're trying to look around for something. And investigation is what you're supposed to use when you already know something is there, and you're just trying to find out more about it. This is the thing I was talking about earlier with the investigation skill, and how people will sometimes use it as a substitute for perception. And I don't really blame them, because perception is used so much already. It kind of makes sense that you'd want to vary which skills people are using. Even though technically all you need is perception in order to determine all secret traps in a room and inside dungeons that you're going through. And perception is easily the most used skill in the game, because it's literally the skill that allows you to perceive the world through your character. And you could even have higher checks and perception skill checks based on which sense you're trying to use in order to perform it. Like bears, for example, have advantage on perception checks as long as they're doing it in order to smell something. So perception and persuasion are the two best skills in the game. Everything else is kind of secondary, with cases being made that maybe stealth and insight are also super high-tiered skills. It really depends on your game, because if you don't have a rogue in your party, then it might be possible that you're never trying to be stealthy at all. If you're playing with a DM who doesn't like to use insight like a lie detector, like they probably should, then insight is not the super all-powerful skill that it's usually used as. But in pretty much every game, no matter how you interpret the rules, perception and persuasion usually come out on top. Alright, and that's the list. All the other skills that weren't mentioned in the video are just more niche in their uses and more highly dependent on specific types of campaigns. Like a survival skill is used a lot more in a wilderness campaign than one where you never go into the woods, for example. If you have any ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.